The wind didn't just howl that night. It screamed, tearing through the skeletal branches of the oaks surrounding my secluded cabin. A torrential downpour lashed against the glass, blurring the world into a gray, shivering mess. I sat by the fireplace, the embers reflecting in a framed photo of Mark, a constant reminder of the silence he left behind 2 years ago. The grief was a familiar, heavy blanket, but tonight, something felt different. Then I heard it. It wasn't the thunder. It was a sound that defied the storm, a low, guttural rasp that vibrated through the floorboards. My heart didn't just race, it hammered against my ribs with a primitive terror. Every instinct I possessed, every nerve ending in my body, screamed at me to bolt the door and hide in the cellar. But instead, I found my hand reaching for the latch. I stepped onto the porch, the freezing rain soaking me instantly. The motion light flickered to life, casting a harsh, stuttering glow over the backyard. At first, I only saw a shadow, a massive, matted shape slumped against the woodpile. It shifted, and a heavy, silver-gray limb dragged across the mud. The creature let out a broken, wet huff. As it turned its head toward the light, I didn't see a monster. I saw a jagged, crimson gash tearing through its shoulder, the fur stained a terrifying, dark slick. Then its eyes met mine, not the mindless yellow of a beast, but eyes filled with an agonizing, human-like plea for mercy. Logic told me this was a predator that could end me in seconds. But looking at that raw, pulsing wound, all I could feel was the echo of my own unresolved pain. I took a breath, swallowed the lump of fear in my throat, and stepped off the porch and into the mud. I was moving toward certain danger, but for the first time in years, I wasn't running away from the dark. The rain continued to hammer against the mud as I knelt, my hands hovering just inches from the creature's matted fur. In the flickering light of the porch, I didn't just see a stray animal. I saw a reflection of the same brokenness I had lived with for 730 days. Before the silence took over this house, there was Mark. Mark, with his crooked laugh and the way he'd leave the radio playing jazz in the kitchen just to keep the shadows at bay. He was the person who made the world feel solid, like the ground wouldn't give way beneath my feet. But then came the accident, the sudden, violent end that left me standing in a hospital hallway holding a plastic bag of his belongings. Since then, I've become a ghost in my own life. I moved to this cabin because the city was too loud with memories, but the forest only offered a different kind of emptiness. My days are measured in cups of coffee that go cold and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I had built a fortress of grief around myself, thinking that if I never let anything in, I could never be hurt again. I've spent 2 years avoiding the gaze of neighbors, skipping holiday invites, and turning off my phone when the concern became too much to bear. I was safe, but I was hollow. My hands, now trembling in the cold, hadn't touched another living soul in months. Looking at this creature, this beast, the world would tell me to fear, I realized we were both bleeding out in the dark. It was wounded by something physical, a jagged tear in its side. I was wounded by a hole in my chest that no amount of time seemed to heal. For the first time since the funeral, the numbness cracked. I wasn't thinking about safety or the impossibility of what lay in my yard. I was thinking about the fact that no one should have to face the end alone in the rain. My grief had made me a hermit, but tonight it was making me something else, a lifeline. I reached out and finally closed the gap, my palm pressing against the creature's wet, heaving side. The moment my skin met the coarse, wet fur, a jolt of pure adrenaline shot through my system, snapping the haze of my grief. This was no longer a shadow or a memory. It was a breathing, dying reality in my backyard. The creature didn't snap. It didn't growl. Instead, it let out a sound I will never forget, a high, thin whine that sounded hauntingly like a sob. Under the flickering yellow light of the porch, the full scale of the horror became clear. This wasn't just a wolf. It was massive, easily the size of a grizzly, with silver-tipped fur that seemed to shimmer unnaturally even through the mud. But the most striking thing was the wound. High on its shoulder, a jagged, blackened hole pulsed with thick, dark blood that refused to clot. It wasn't a claw mark from a territorial dispute. It was a clean, surgical puncture. The beast's breathing was shallow and wet, each exhale sending a mist of steam into the freezing night air. Every few seconds, its massive body would rack with a violent tremor, a physical manifestation of a life force flickering out. It looked at me again, and the beast label felt like a lie. Those eyes, deep, amber, and swirling with a very human intelligence, tracked my every movement with a mixture of terror and resignation. I realized then that the strange sound I'd heard earlier wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was the sound of something being hunted. The woods behind my house, usually a sanctuary of silence, now felt heavy with an unseen presence, as if the darkness itself was watching, waiting for the creature to take its last breath. I looked back at my warm, dry kitchen door and then down at the shivering mass of fur at my feet. Logic demanded I go inside and call the authorities. But looking at the silver creature, I knew that if I left it here, it wouldn't be alive by dawn. The choice wasn't about safety anymore. It was about whether I could live with another death on my conscience. I gripped the creature's thick scruff, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I've got you," I whispered, the words feeling strange after so much silence. "I've got you." The creature's weight was immense, a physical manifestation of the danger I was inviting into my home. Every muscle in my arms strained as I tried to guide the massive, shivering frame toward the back door. My mind played a frantic loop of what-ifs. What if it turned on me once it was warm? What if the thing that shot it was still out there in the tree line, watching through a scope? I reached the threshold of the kitchen, the linoleum floor slick with rain and blood. For a heartbeat, I stopped. To pull this beast across the doorway was to shatter the sanctuary I'd built to keep the world out. Logic screamed that this was a predator designed to kill, a monster of folklore that belonged in the dark. But as another tremor racked its body, the creature's head slumped against my shin, its breathing a ragged, desperate whistle. In that moment, fear lost its grip. I wasn't a victim of my grief anymore. I was a protector. I grabbed a handful of its thick, silver-gray fur and heaved with everything I had. "Come on," I grunted, my boots slipping on the floor. "Just a little further." The beast let out a low, guttural moan, not a threat, but a sound of profound exhaustion. Slowly, agonizingly, it hauled its massive bulk over the doorframe. I slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. I stood there, panting, looking at the creature now sprawled across my kitchen rug. The contrast was jarring, the domestic warmth of my toaster and flower-patterned curtains against the raw, wild blood of a werewolf. I didn't run for the phone. Instead, I ran for the first aid kit and a pile of clean towels. My hands were stained crimson, and my heart was still hammering a warning against my ribs, but the paralysis was gone. I had made my choice. I was choosing compassion over the safety of my isolation. As I knelt beside the heaving chest of the beast, I realized I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. I was no longer just a woman mourning a lost life. I was a woman fighting to save a new one, no matter how dangerous that life might be. The kitchen, usually a place of sterile silence, and the faint scent of Earl Grey, now smelled of wet fur, metallic copper, and something sharp, like the ozone before a lightning strike. I knelt on the linoleum, my breath hitching as I peeled back the matted, silver-gray hair around the wound. This was the moment where my reality began to warp, where the animal I thought I was saving started to reveal a nature that defied every textbook on biology. As I pressed a clean white towel against the jagged hole in its shoulder, the creature let out a low, vibrating hum that rattled the jars in my spice rack. I expected to see the jagged tear of a predator's tooth or the messy spray of a shotgun blast. Instead, what I found was chillingly precise. The wound wasn't bleeding like a normal injury. The edges of the flesh were blackened, cauterized by a heat so intense it looked like the skin had been branded. And there, buried deep within the muscle, was a glimmer of something artificial. Using a pair of sterilized tweezers from my kit, I probed gently. The creature flinched, its massive claws digging grooves into my wooden floorboards, but it didn't strike. With a steady hand I didn't know I still possessed, I pulled. A heavy, rhythmic clink sounded as a silver-colored slug dropped into the metal basin. It wasn't lead. It was etched with strange, microscopic ruins, symbols that seemed to glow with a faint, sickly violet light before fading into dull gray. This wasn't a hunter's accident. This was a targeted execution. Someone had spent a fortune to craft a weapon specifically designed to kill exactly what was lying on my floor. I looked at the bullet, then back at the creature. Its breathing was changing. The heavy, canine panting was smoothing out, becoming longer and more rhythmic. The massive paws, which only moments ago could have crushed my skull, were twitching, the thick black claws beginning to retract into the pads of the feet. The fur was the most unsettling part. It started to recede, not falling out but pulling back into the skin like a tide going out. The silver sheen vanished, replaced by the pale, bruised flesh of a man's shoulder. I stumbled back, the tweezers clattering to the floor. The beast was shrinking, its bones popping and snapping with the sound of dry wood breaking, reconfiguring themselves into a human frame. The mystery had escalated from a wounded animal to a supernatural conspiracy in the span of 5 minutes. My mind raced with questions I was terrified to answer. Who fired that silver bullet? Why were they hunting him? And more importantly, what happened when the people who shot him realized he hadn't died in the woods, but had been dragged into the house of a woman who lived all alone? I watched, paralyzed, as the last of the fur vanished from the nape of a neck. There, lying where the monster had been, was a man. He was covered in the mud of my backyard, his face gaunt and pale, but unmistakably human. The transition was a big reveal that shattered my understanding of the world, a payoff for the risk I had taken just minutes before. The external threat wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a ticking clock. If someone went to the trouble of engraving a bullet with runes, they weren't going to stop until they finished the job. I was no longer just a bystander in a storm. I was an accomplice to a creature that shouldn't exist, holding the evidence of a crime I didn't understand. Since the previous section already touched upon the physical shift, we will now dive into the full, harrowing completion of the transformation and the immediate aftermath as the big reveal settles in. The air in the kitchen felt thick, ionized by the impossible energy radiating from the body on the floor. I watched, my back pressed hard against the refrigerator, as the creature I had dragged from the mud underwent its final, agonizing metamorphosis. The sound was the worst part, a wet, visceral symphony of shifting cartilage and snapping bone that no human should ever have to hear. The massive, lupin ribcage collapsed inward, reshaping itself into the narrower, defined chest of a man. The elongated snout retreated into a face with sharp, high cheekbones and a jawline covered in dark stubble. Where there had been silver-gray fur, there was now only skin, pale, sweat-slicked, and mapped with old scars that told a story of a life lived in a state of perpetual war. He lay there, gasping, his fingers curling into the fibers of my rug. They weren't claws anymore. They were human hands, trembling with the same exhaustion I felt in my own soul. The beast was gone. In its place was a man who looked to be in his early 30s, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with rain and blood. He looked vulnerable, frighteningly so. The raw power that had terrified me moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked as though he had been broken by the world 1,000 times over. This was the first major payoff of the night, a moment where the mystery of the what was answered, only to be replaced by the much more dangerous who. For a long minute, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and his ragged, shallow breathing. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were no longer the glowing, predatory amber of the wolf. They were a deep, stormy hazel, swirling with a mixture of confusion, pain, and a sharp, sudden spike of fear as he realized he wasn't alone. He tried to push himself up, his muscles corded with tension, but the movement reopened the cauterized wound in his shoulder. He hissed in pain and slumped back down, his gaze locking onto mine. "You," he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. It was a human voice, full of the same tremors I had heard in his lupin whines. "You stayed." I couldn't find my voice. I just stood there, clutching a blood-stained towel to my chest. Every instinct I had honed over 2 years of isolation was telling me that I had made a terrible mistake. I had invited a myth into my kitchen. I had touched the supernatural with my bare hands. But as I looked at him, really looked at him, I didn't see a monster. I saw the same hollowed-out look I saw in the mirror every morning. He wasn't just a werewolf. He was someone who had lost everything, someone who was being hunted for the very thing that made him different. I took the bullet out. I finally managed to whisper, pointing toward the silver slug sitting in the basin. His eyes shifted to the silver metal, and a flicker of recognition, and perhaps a deeper, more profound terror, crossed his face. He knew exactly what that bullet meant, and he knew that by saving him, I had just painted a target on my own back. The silence that followed wasn't the empty silence of my grief. It was a heavy, expectant silence, charged with the realization that our lives were now inextricably linked. The woman who couldn't let go of the past had just stepped into a future that was violent, impossible, and undeniably alive. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the sharp, medicinal smell of the first aid kit. He didn't move from the rug, his body still trembling from the residual shock of the transformation. I finally found my legs and moved to the stove, my hands shaking as I reached for a kettle. I needed a mundane task to tether me to reality, something that felt like the life I had before the world splintered. "You should be running," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate against the kitchen tiles. He didn't look at me. He looked at the silver slug in the basin, his eyes reflecting a deep-seated weariness. People who see what you just saw, they usually don't wait around to ask questions. I turned, leaning against the counter. "I've spent 2 years running from things I can't change," I said, the honesty of it surprising even me. A man turning into a wolf is just one more impossible thing to add to the list. He looked up then, his hazel eyes narrowing as he studied my face. He didn't see a hunter. He saw the hollowed-out expression of someone who had lived in the dark for a long time. "You lost someone," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My husband," I whispered. 2 years ago. Since then, I've just been waiting for the clock to run out." He let out a short, bitter huff of a laugh that turned into a wince of pain. "I lost my life a long time ago, too, just in a different way." He gestured vaguely toward his shoulder, where the silver bullet had left its blackened mark. "This curse, it doesn't just take your skin. It takes your name, your family, your right to exist in the light." He told me his name was Elias. He spoke of a life spent in the shadows, moving from one isolated town to the next, always one step ahead of the hunters. An organization dedicated to cleansing the world of his kind. He lived in a state of perpetual trauma, a cycle of violence and isolation that mirrored my own self-imposed exile. He was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without the intent to harm, just as I had forgotten what it felt like to care for something other than a memory. "They won't stop," Elias said, his gaze shifting back to the window where the storm still raged. "The silver was meant to track me as much as kill me. If I'm here, you're in danger." "I was already in danger," I countered, stepping closer to him. "I was disappearing. Every day a little more of me went quiet." I knelt beside him, reaching out to adjust the bandage I'd placed on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact, a reflexive jerk of muscles used to pain, but then he stilled. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his forehead dropping toward my shoulder. In that moment, the beast and the widow were gone. We were just two broken things finding a brief moment of gravity in a world that was trying to spin us both off into the void. My grief didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a bridge. I realized that by choosing to help him, I wasn't just saving a stranger from a bullet. I was saving myself from the silence. "Then we'll wait for them together," I whispered into the quiet of the kitchen. The storm outside seemed to pulse with a new, predatory energy. But for the first time in 2 years, the fire in my hearth felt like it was actually fighting back the cold. The storm outside began to lose its fury, transitioning from a violent scream to a rhythmic, heavy pat-at-her against the roof. Inside, the kitchen felt like a bubble suspended in time. I moved Elias from the floor to the velvet armchair in the living room, the one Mark used to sit in, and wrapped him in a heavy wool blanket. For the first time in 2 years, the house didn't feel haunted by what was missing. It felt occupied by something that desperately needed to stay. "Why did you do it?" Elias asked softly, his voice finally losing that jagged, predatory edge. He watched me as I tended to a small fire in the hearth, his hazel eyes tracking my every movement with a mix of wonder and wary confusion. You saw what I was. You heard the bones breaking. Most people would have let the woods take me. I poked at a stubborn log, watching the sparks dance upward. Maybe I was tired of letting things be taken, I replied, sitting on the rug near his feet. After Mark died, I felt like a spectator in my own life. I watched him go, I watched the world move on, and I just stopped. Saving you was the first thing I've actually chosen to do in a long time. Elias reached a hand out from under the blanket, his skin pale but warming. He didn't grab, he simply rested his palm face up on the arm of the chair, an invitation. I've spent a decade being a monster to some and a target to others, he whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. I forgot that there was anything else left inside. You looking at me not as a beast, but as a man, it's a different kind of silver. It burns, but it heals. We sat there for hours, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. We spoke of the things we'd lost. He told me about the sister he had to leave behind when his first transformation turned him into a fugitive. I told him about the jazz music that used to fill this kitchen. We were two different species, born of different worlds, but our traumas spoke the same language. The bonding wasn't just in the words, but in the quiet safety of the room. For a moment, the hunters and the silver bullets felt like a fever dream. But as the clock chimed midnight, Elias stiffened, his eyes darting toward the darkened window. The piece was a fragile glass, and something in the woods was about to shatter it. The fragile piece of the living room shattered not with a bang, but with a clinical, artificial silence. The crickets in the tall grass outside abruptly stopped their chirping. Elias froze, his hazel eyes snapping toward the darkened window as his nostrils flared, catching a scent that didn't belong to the damp earth or the dying fire. "They're here," he whispered, the human vulnerability in his voice instantly replaced by a low, vibrating growl of survival. I looked out toward the tree line. A single, high-intensity beam of white light cut through the mist, sweeping across the porch like a physical blade. Then came another and another. These weren't the erratic flashlights of local hunters. These were tactical sweeps, methodical and cold. The hunters, the organization Elias had spent a decade outrunning, had tracked the silver resonance of the bullet I pulled from his flesh. "Isabella, get to the cellar," Elias commanded, struggling to stand as the blanket slid from his shoulders, revealing the dark bruising around his wound. "I'm not leaving you," I snapped back, my fear transforming into a sharp, jagged defiance. I had spent 2 years losing things. I wasn't going to let a group of men in tactical gear take the only spark of life that had entered this house since the funeral. A heavy thud vibrated against the front door, followed by a voice amplified through a megaphone, devoid of emotion, sounding more like a machine than a man. "Isabella Vance, you are harboring a Class A biohazard. Open the door and step away from the entity. Failure to comply will be met with lethal neutralization." The stakes had shifted from a private tragedy to a public execution. They didn't see a man in my armchair. They saw an entity, a hazard to be erased. As the first red laser dot danced across the floral wallpaper of my living room, settling right on Elia's chest, I realized that the forest was no longer a sanctuary. The external threat wasn't just coming for him. It was coming for the choice I had made to be human again. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker, my knuckles white. If they wanted the beast, they would have to go through the woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The red laser dot danced across Elia's chest, a silent countdown to an execution. But as the heavy boots of the hunters crunched on the gravel outside, Elias grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly human and desperate. "Isabella, listen to me," he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper against the mechanical drone of the megaphone. "The silver, the reason they use that specific alloy, it's not just to kill, it's to lock the molecular structure. They want me trapped in the shift so they can study the hazard." He reached into the pocket of the tattered coat I'd draped over him earlier, pulling out a small, crushed leather vial he'd been hiding. Inside was a shimmering, viscous liquid that looked like liquid starlight. "My sister, she was a chemist before they took her," he panted, his eyes wide with a sudden, flickering light. She spent years developing a stabilizer. It's not a cure for what I am, but it's a cure for the madness. It allows the human mind to remain in control during the full moon. It stops the predator from erasing the man. I looked from the vial to the door, where the first heavy blow of a battering ram made the frame groan. This was the hope element, the possibility that he didn't have to be a monster, and I didn't have to be his victim. If I take this now, Elias continued, his gaze locking onto mine with an intense, raw honesty, I can fight them without losing myself. I can protect you without becoming the thing they say I am. But the reaction, it requires a catalyst. It requires a physical anchor to the human world while the serum works. He held out the vial to me. The hope wasn't just in the liquid. It was in the realization that there was a way out of this cycle of blood and silver. If we could survive the next hour, he wouldn't just be a survivor. He would be free. I need you to help me hold on, he whispered. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about the potential for a future where the beast and the woman could both walk in the light. I took the vial, my fingers brushing his, and for the first time, the ticking of the clock didn't feel like a funeral march. It felt like a heartbeat. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11, each chime vibrating through the floorboards like a funeral bell. Outside, the heavy clouds that had masked the sky began to fracture, torn apart by a rising wind that carried the scent of ozone and impending change. A pale, silver light began to bleed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, signaling the arrival of the apex of the lunar cycle. "There's no more time," Elias gasped, his body arching as his bones began to hum with a pre-transformation frequency. The serum was in my hand, but the window for it to work was closing with every passing second. The full moon was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical weight pressing down on the house, pulling at the tides of his blood. Beyond the front door, the hunters had ceased their shouting. The silence was more terrifying than the megaphone. It meant they were setting charges, preparing for a breach that would end in a hail of silver and fire. I could hear the high-pitched whine of electronic equipment, scanners looking for the biohazard heartbeat that was currently racing against mine. "The serum needs to be in my system before the moon hits its zenith," Elias whispered, his eyes flickering between hazel and a predatory gold. "If the transformation starts before the stabilizer takes hold, the man dies. Only the beast will be left to face them." I looked at the clock. 59 minutes until the moon reached the center of the sky. 59 minutes to bridge the gap between a miracle and a massacre. Every second spent second-guessing was a second we didn't have. The urgency created a sharp, cold clarity in my chest, a retention spike of pure adrenaline. I popped the seal on the vial, the liquid starlight shimmering with a desperate promise. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, drowning out the wind, drowning out the hunters. It was a race against the cosmos and the men at the door. I had to choose to act now, or lose the only life that had made mine worth living again. The battering ram hit the door again, the heavy oak splintering like dry bone. Outside, the hunters were no longer asking, they were taking. But inside the dim living room, a far more agonizing choice weighed on my soul, the impossible choice that would define whether we lived or died. Elias looked at the shimmering serum in my hand, then at the moon-drenched window. "The stabilizer! It isn't a passive cure, Isabella," he choked out, his muscles corded with the strain of holding back the shift. "For it to bond with my DNA before the moon reaches its zenith, it needs a human anchor. It needs a blood catalyst. Yours." I froze. He wasn't asking for a bandage or a kind word anymore. He was asking me to risk my life to save his. To provide the catalyst, I would have to be in direct physical contact with him during the most violent moments of the transformation. If the serum failed, or if I was a second too slow, I wouldn't be his savior. I would be his first prey. "If you do this," Elias whispered, his eyes now a swirling, unstable gold, "you might not walk away. They are coming through that door with silver and fire. If you stay by my side, they will treat you like the monster I am." Every instinct I had left, every bit of self-preservation that had kept me alive in my lonely cabin, screamed at me to run. I could slip out the back, vanish into the trees, and let the hunters finish their grim business. I could go back to my safe, quiet, hollow life. But then I looked at his hand, still trembling on the armchair. It was a hand that had reached for mine not out of hunger, but out of a desperate need for connection. I realized that my safety had been its own kind of death. To run now would be to choose the silence of the grave over the chaos of the living. "I'm not going back to the dark," I said, my voice finally steady. I didn't just hold the vial, I stepped into his space, my heart hammering against my ribs in a high-tension peak. I took the iron fire poker and made a shallow lace in my palm, then pressed my bleeding hand against the wound on his shoulder, mixing our life force as the first flashbang grenade shattered the kitchen window. This was the moment of no return. I was sacrificing my safety for a chance at his redemption, locked in a life-or-death emotional peak that no bullet could touch. The front door didn't just open. It disintegrated under a tactical breach charge, sending shards of oak whistling through the air like shrapnel. White smoke billowed into the hallway, illuminated by the rhythmic, strobing pulse of weapon-mounted lights. This was the physical peak, the moment where the internal struggle met the external violence. "Contact, target is stationary," a voice barked, muffled by a gas mask. I didn't pull away. My bleeding palm was pressed firmly against Elia's shoulder, the warmth of my blood acting as the catalyst for the shimmering serum. Beneath my hand, his body was a war zone. I could feel his muscles liquefying and reforming, his heartbeat erratic and thundering like a trapped bird. The transformation was happening, but it was different this time, controlled, anchored by the physical contact and the stabilizer coursing through his veins. "Step away from the hazard, ma'am. Now." A red laser dot settled on my forehead, then slid down to my heart. I looked into the blinding glare of their lights, my fingers interlaced with Elia's human hand, even as his other arm grew thick with silver fur and lethal muscle. The air hummed with the tension of a pulled trigger. Elias let out a roar, but it wasn't the mindless howl of a beast. It was the defiant cry of a man reclaiming his soul. His body expanded, his height towering over mine, yet his eyes remained hazel, clear, focused, and filled with a protective rage. He didn't lung for me. He stepped in front of me, his massive frame becoming a living shield against the silver-tipped barrels leveled at us. The lead hunter stepped into the light, his finger tightening on the trigger of a specialized rifle. The room was a powder keg of safe danger, where every breath felt like it could be my last. I could see the sweat on the hunter's brow through his visor. He was expecting a monster to put down, but he was staring at a miracle, a creature of myth with the eyes of a man, standing guard over a woman who refused to flinch. The countdown to the full moon's zenith hit 0. The light through the window was blinding, the energy in the room reaching a breaking point that threatened to level the house. The lead hunter's finger tightened on the trigger, the air thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder. But before the silver round could leave the chamber, a sharp, metallic whistle cut through the chaos of the breach. The tactical team froze, their red laser dots wavering as a figure stepped through the splintered remains of my front door. Not a soldier, but a man in a tailored charcoal suit that looked grotesquely out of place in my blood-stained kitchen. This was the architect of the hunt, the man who had authorized the silver bullet. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a small, blackened remote and an air of chilling authority. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice thin and precise. He didn't look at the hunters. He looked at Elias, his eyes widening as he realized the entity was standing upright, shielding a human woman instead of tearing her throat out. "The serum. You actually found a way to stabilize the cellular collapse." The interrupted climax added a new layer of tension. The hunters weren't just here to kill a beast. They were here to reclaim a proprietary asset. The man in the suit stepped closer, his gaze shifting to my bleeding palm pressed against Elia's fur-covered shoulder. "You've compromised the containment, Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone shifting to a mock-sympathetic purr. "You've turned a biological weapon into a sentimental tragedy. Do you have any idea how much that blood on your hands is worth to us?" Elias let out a low, vibrating growl, his massive chest heaving. He wasn't just a monster anymore. He was a witness to their crimes. The antagonist raised the remote, a small light on its face blinking a rhythmic, predatory red. "If we can't have a stable subject," the man whispered, "we'll settle for a scorched earth." The threat was no longer just a bullet. It was a total erasure. I gripped Elia's hand tighter, the silver light of the moon reaching its absolute peak through the shattered roof. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting against the men who believed that pain could be owned and sold. The man in the suit pressed a button on the remote, and a high-pitched, agonizing frequency began to bleed from the tactical speakers. It was a sound designed to trigger the primal, violent instincts of a werewolf, to override the man and force the beast to the surface. Elia's body jerked, his muscles rippling under his fur as his hazel eyes began to cloud with that terrifying, mindless gold once more. But I didn't let go. I ignored the hunters, the red lasers, and the agonizing noise. I stepped into the heat of his shifting body and wrapped my arms around his massive, furred neck. I pressed my forehead against his, my own blood still slick between us, acting as the anchor he needed. "Elias, stay with me," I commanded, my voice cutting through the electronic whine. "You are not their weapon. You are not a hazard. You are a man who saved me from the silence. Look at me." The tension in the room was suffocating, a life-or-death emotional peak that felt like it would shatter the house. Slowly, the golden tide in his eyes receded. The snarl died in his throat, replaced by a shuddering human breath. The serum, powered by the connection I refused to break, finally took full hold. He reached up with a massive, clawed hand and gently cupped my face, a gesture of pure, heartbreaking humanity. The man in the suit stepped back, his clinical composure finally cracking. He had spent millions trying to control the beast through pain and science, but he was currently watching it be tamed by something he couldn't quantify. A choice. "He's stable," I whispered, looking directly into the lead hunter's visor. "He's not a monster, but you are." The red lasers wavered, and then, one by one, they dropped to the floor. Even the soldiers, trained for lethal neutralization, couldn't ignore the scene before them. The core theme of love versus fear had finally reached its payoff. The beast was still there, powerful and ancient. But the man was the one holding my hand. We had won the most important battle, not with silver or fire, but by refusing to be afraid. The high-pitched frequency died abruptly as the man in the charcoal suit lowered his remote, his face twisted in a mask of silent, impotent fury. He looked at the tactical team, but they remained still, their weapons lowered. They were soldiers, and they had just witnessed something that defied their briefing. A biohazard exhibiting the most human of traits, mercy and restraint. "We're done here," the lead hunter said, his voice crackling through his comms. He gave a sharp signal, and the red laser dots vanished for good. Without a backward glance, the team began their tactical retreat, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The man in the suit lingered for a heartbeat, a predator who had lost his prey, before scurrying after them into the dark. The silence that followed was different from the silence of my grief. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears, exhausted, but peaceful. Elia's body began to shimmer one last time. The massive, silver-furred frame receded, but not with the violent bone-snapping of before. Under the stabilizing influence of the serum and the calm of our connection, he shifted back into his human form with a fluid, natural grace. He slumped against the armchair, naked and shivering, but his eyes were clear hazel, devoid of the beast's golden fire. I grabbed the wool blanket and wrapped it around him, my own hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline ebbed. The house was a wreck. The door was gone, the windows were shattered, and the floor was stained with blood. But for the first time in 2 years, the air inside felt clean. "They're gone," I whispered, pulling the blanket tight around his shoulders. Elias looked at his hands, human hands, and then at me. "You saved me, Isabella, not just from the silver, but from the dark." We had survived the night, the hunters, and the moon. The impossible had happened. The beast had been tamed, and the widow had found a reason to fight. The resolution wasn't just in the absence of the hunters. It was in the presence of a future that, for the first time, didn't feel like a sentence. We sat together amidst the ruins of my kitchen, watching the first pale light of dawn begin to touch the horizon. The first rays of dawn filtered through the shattered remains of my kitchen window, turning the floating dust motes into tiny, golden embers. The violence of the night had been replaced by a heavy, profound stillness. Elias sat on the floor, the wool blanket draped over his shoulders, watching the sunlight touch the blood-stained linoleum. He looked at his hands, human hands, steady and warm, and then he looked at me. The beast wasn't gone, it was just quiet. For the first time in 10 years, Elias wasn't a fugitive from his own skin. The stabilizer had worked, but it was the anchor of my touch that had kept him from drifting into the abyss. He reached out, his fingers brushing the bandage on my palm, the small sacrifice I had made to keep him whole. "I've spent my life waiting for the moon to take me," he whispered, his eyes moist with a relief that was almost painful to witness. "I never thought I'd see a morning where I didn't have to check the mirror to see if I was still there." I sat down beside him, our shoulders touching. The grief that had been my only companion for 2 years, the ghost of Mark, the silence of the cabin, felt different now. It hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It had become the soil from which this strange, new connection had grown. I realized then that healing isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of a reason to keep going. We didn't need to speak about what came next, the repairs, the hunters who might return, or the impossible nature of our bond. In this moment, the payoff was the simple act of breathing in a quiet room. He leaned his head against mine, and for the first time since the accident, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the end. I felt like I was at the beginning. The woman who helped the beast hadn't just saved a monster, she had saved herself. And the man who was supposed to be a predator had become the very thing that brought the light back into my house. We were both broken, both scarred by silver bullets of different kinds, but as the sun rose over the pines, we were finally, undeniably, alive. The sun climbed higher, casting long, warm shadows across the scarred floor of the cabin. Looking at Elias, I realized that the beast wasn't the monster I had seen in the mud, and the hero wasn't the woman who had pulled him inside. Those were just labels given to us by a world that values safety over soul. The truth was much simpler and much more terrifying. We are all wounded. We are all carrying silver bullets in our hearts, remnants of past traumas, losses that won't heal, and labels that try to define us by our darkest hours. We spend our lives building cabins in the woods to keep the world out, thinking that isolation is the same thing as peace. But peace doesn't come from hiding. It comes from the moment you decide that another person's pain is more important than your own fear. Society tells us to run from the monsters. It tells us to lock our doors when the unknown appears in our backyard. But tonight proved that the real danger isn't the creature with the claws. It's the heart that has forgotten how to feel. Compassion is the only stabilizer strong enough to hold back the madness of this world. It is the anchor that turns a beast into a man and a ghost into a living, breathing woman. If I had stayed in my grief, I would have died in that cabin long ago, even if my heart was still beating. By choosing to help the beast, I didn't just save his life. I reclaimed my own humanity. We are not defined by the scars we carry, but by the hands we reach out to hold when the storm is at its worst. Because in the end, love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice. It's the decision to stay when every instinct tells you to run. It's the belief that no one, no matter how broken, how cursed, or how different, deserves to bleed out in the rain alone. If you've ever felt like an outsider or struggled to find light in your darkest moments, I hope this story reminded you that compassion is the most powerful force we have. Sometimes, the monsters we fear are just souls waiting for someone to be brave enough to look past their scars. If you enjoyed this journey of mystery and redemption, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear this message today. What would you have done if you found a creature in your backyard? Would you have stayed, or would you have run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to see more stories where the unexpected meets the emotional, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for watching and for choosing to see the humanity in the shadows. I'll see you in the next video.